As you have understood from the introduction, I know very little about monetary economics, which makes me the right moderator at this moment. Nadine helped me in introducing our distinguished members of the panel, so I decided I'll take few minutes, it maybe turn out to be a little bit more than few minutes, in introducing their economies and comparing the, maybe I'll be able to. זה עבד מקודם.
כן? איזה זה שלך?
לא.
זה לא זה?
לא.
איפה שלך?
מצגות לכנס, presentation, כן. ו-second presentation. זהו, כן. אוקיי.
אוקיי.
תודה. So I decided I'll spend some time comparing the achievements and the problems following the 2008-2009 crisis of these economies. And so what were the symptoms? We'll start with annual growth rates. Everyone notices, of course, the big dip in the 2008-2009 year. Israel was fortunate in taking its beating already earlier, in 2001 and 2002, following the Intifada and the dot-com debacle. So it was immune to the, or slightly immune to the crisis which affected others, and was still able, the only one in our sample, to maintain a positive growth rate. Israel was also, not having suffered from the big decline, was able to maintain a decent growth rate throughout the period, whereas our European visitors had to go through a second round of following the European recession, and both the Swedes and the Czech economy were hit, and then had to recuperate, whereas the US recuperation was quite gradual. If I have to rank the different economies, Israel was had the best record in terms of growth, followed by the Czech Republic, and the third runner was Brazil. But in Brazil we observe that there is a very clear pattern where growth rates are declining over the three different periods, the 2000-2007, the 2008-2009 period, and the follow-up after 2010. So this is the record in terms of growth. What is the record in terms of unemployment? It's clear that the workers took the brunt of the beating. The Israeli workers, the Israeli workers suffered already at 2001-2002, hitting an unemployment rate of 13%, which was declining ever since. In the other countries, the unemployment jump occurred following the 2008-2009 crisis, and then started gradually to decline, with Israel and the US doing equally well. And Israel's unemployment rate right now is at its lowest in its history. Still the Czechs were able to beat Israel and have even a lower rate, whereas in Brazil, the Brazilian unemployment reflects the gross record and unemployment being at a relatively high rate. The other battlefield which was fought was the one of the exchange market. And here the dollar was losing ground to the euro up to the crisis, but since then was strengthening, and this decoupling forced the smaller countries to choose sides. The European definitely went with the euro, the Czechs tying for almost 3.5 years their the rate of the koruna to the rate of the euro. The Israelis, perhaps unintentionally, chose to stick with the dollar, and the average exchange rate compared with the dollar hardly changed since 2010. So having noticed the symptoms of our patients, what was the temperature? Looking at inflation rate, and I leave at this stage, I'll leave the story of Brazil to be told, but to Ilan, we observe fluctuations which usually relate to the stage at which the country is in its business cycle, with one exception. The Israelis' inflation rate plays completely a complete independent game, in particular in recent years. It imported its low inflation from Europe, perhaps from world markets, in the early 2010, but then had a very low inflation rate since 2013, 2014, which is quite difficult to explain. What were the prescription? Well, we know the prescription, the major prescription was the average monetary rate, and again, here we hit the zero low bound, which was interpreted slightly differently by different countries, 0.25, 0.01, the Czechs even went to 0.05, the European to 0.0, the Swedes to minus 0.5, but by 2014 they had to look for additional weapons, and they found them either in the FX reserves or in QE operation, and we observe how the assets of the central banks changed over time. Israel, in this sense, was quite modest. Its FX reserves only doubled. Other countries went to 3 or 4 times increase in their assets or in their FX reserves. Forward guidance was a major tool, but I cannot really describe it by a graph, but as a member of the committee, I know how many hours we spend rethinking every word, signaling or non-signaling to the market. What are the after effects? Well, one, of course, is the long-term bonds, the 10-year government bonds, and we observe the gradual decline in rates up to quite recently, and the risks it may pertain in the long run. And then, of course, we have the housing market. The housing market seems to behave quite, except for the Czechs, have a universal pattern. It doubles or slightly more or slightly less than doubles, and the question is only in how many years it has attained this record. In Israel it has done so in 8 years, in the United States, if I'm not mistaken, in 7 years, and the Swedes, for the Swedes it took about 17 years, but the implication for the market are clear, and the question is it the rate of acceleration which is a problem, or is it the financial stability which such an acceleration involves, is whether we should focus on this feature. Finally, what was the recovery rate? Well, I think in most of these countries, if not in all of them, monetary policy played a major role in stabilizing the ship. And that's definitely, as had already been mentioned, true for Israel, but that is also true for our other visitors. But how well did they perform when it comes to inflationary target, which is part of the topic we are going to discuss? And here, if I look at the 1 to 3 range, then as a previous professor, I would say that Israel deserves a D. The Swedes did equally well. The Czechs reserve a C. The United States a C. Brazil is not in this picture because it has its own rules. If I look at the official rate, then Brazil is doing quite well with over a C with the United States. The Swedes and the Czechs are running a D, and unfortunately for Israel, I have to say the record is an F. So it seems that we have to make a distinction between the official proclamation of maintaining an inflation target and what the bank is actually doing, namely looking for a mixed diet of growth, inflation, housing market, etc. In this sense, I think the mixture we did all very well. In terms of the specific target, we may have done not so well. So the question that I addressed to our panel were, what were the special problems faced by the crisis, faced by the countries due to the crisis, and how did they cope with them? And then we'll discuss some more specific questions relating to inflation target, fiscal stability later on. The first speaker is going to be Professor Fischer.
Well, thanks very much, Ruben. Thank you also, Vice Governor Nadim. And I wanted to talk about U.S. monetary policy. I wanted just to make one thing clear, though. Every cab driver in this country cannot distinguish former Governor Frankel from former Governor Fischer. I am former Governor Fischer. Anyway, well, I mean, call this U.S. monetary policy the dual mandate of inflation and unemployment. And since 2012, the Fed has specified itself as having a dual mandate, that is both price stability and full employment, that sometimes relates to the fact that the law actually includes a third variable, which is a moderate long-term interest rates. But, you know, you say if the other things are satisfied, you'll achieve the interest rate target. I think this approach takes on the awkward problem that virtually every central bank, even those who call themselves inflation targeters, have in practice had at least two goals. One, inflation, and the other, some measure of activity, whether it to be full employment or something else. There is no country where they do not take the level of activity into account, and I've read enough Bundesbank reports to check even on them. Well, there's a whole lot. I thought I'd give you the long lecture, but I see that I can't. So I was going to start talking about the way the meetings of the Federal Open Market Committee are set up, because it's a very complicated process. You have 19 members of the Federal Open Market Committee, if they ever get to nominate 7 people who are in place on the Federal Reserve Board. All the time I was there, it never reached more than 5. And it only reached 5 because on the day that I was sworn in, it was down to 3. And they realized they better do something. It's down to 3 again, by the way. Well, there are a lot of things done in the Fed's framework. I'd only want to mention one because there's enormous uncertainty about it, and that is, how do you deal with future interest rates when you're making forecasts? Clearly, if you're a policymaker, you have to figure out what interest rates are going to be. What do you put in? Well, the Bank of England used to use market rates. Many use the predictions of the research department. And the Fed has a very interesting approach, which it mentions precisely what it's doing, but many people don't realize. Every person is asked on the Open Market Committee is asked the following question: what interest rates what interest rates will be optimal from the viewpoint of meeting the Fed's goals over the next 3 years? And this is the federal funds rate. So you write down a path for the federal funds rate. They take the median of that path as the forecast. So it's not a forecast. It's in essence, if you think about what they're doing, they're trying to figure out how they'll vote in the future, because everybody's essentially asked today, how will you vote down the road? And that's how they get there. So there's no actual expected path of interest rates, except in some very loose sense, that lies behind the Fed's interest rate projections, future interest rate projections. And the common statement, the Fed is committed to 3 increases in the interest rate in 2019, is simply not true. The Fed never did. The Open Market Committee does not discuss those paths. They are what they are, and you get on with them and you use them in your forecast, but you don't have a vote on whose interest rate forecast you like the best. It's just the average that is used to form a basis for the interest rate path. And that's all I want to say on the way the committee is set up, except to add, as I'm sure you all know, that although when there's a full Federal Open Market, Federal Reserve Board, there are 19 members of the Open Market Committee, and only 12 of them vote. And the 12 who vote are, there are only 12, they're not only, there is only 12 who vote, There are, in principle, the 7 members of the board, which is in Washington, and 5 of the 12 presidents of the reserve banks, the regional banks. And it's on a rotation, except New York doesn't rotate. It always has a vote, and some of them only once every 3 times, and some of them are once every 4 times, depending on how important they were in the American economy in 1914. And this is as good a basis as any for choosing people for a committee like that. So I now want to talk about what are the serious issues that the Fed has faced, and I'll go through some of them. Well, the Fed had talked about its dual mandate for a long time. They'd never put numbers on it. And in inflation, stable prices, low inflation, and some measure of full employment. So in 2012, Ben Bernanke did something which everyone else I'd ever spoken to was convinced could never happen. He got the Congress to agree that the Fed could decide what the target inflation rate should be if it took into account the language of the law as to what the target inflation rate was supposed to do, and similarly with full employment. So the Fed came up with the target inflation rate of the Bank of Israel and others, 2%. This, do they, this is a voting process. So 2%. We now have an incredible situation in the international economy, which isn't really realized. We've never had a definition of price stability. We had the gold standard. What did price stability mean? It meant you were supposed to keep your prices in a fixed relation to what the price of gold was. Then we had the exchange rate-based systems of the post-World War II period, and then we got no particular basis for fixing the interest rate. And now there's a convention. The great majority of the world economy has a 2% inflation target. If you ask people in surveys, what inflation rate do you expect 10 years from now? The answer is almost always 2%. Where does it come from? It can come from nothing but confidence that the central banks will be trying to get there because they all have the same target. And I think it's very valuable, and I think it has an implication for why the Phillips curve is flatter than it's ever been, and various other phenomena in the international economy. So the Fed's target inflation rate is 2%. I don't know what the discussion focused on, or whether they said we should just be like everyone else for once. On the target unemployment rate, there is no number. The target unemployment rate is what the people who answer the survey that the Fed takes for every meeting, what unemployment rate do you expect in the long run? And they'll give a number, and that's taken as the target. We are well below that. It's about 3.7% now. That target measured that way is about 4.4%, 4.5%. But it's not, if we violate that, nothing happens. Nobody gets very excited. And it doesn't have the same force that the inflation rate has. Well, how do the members of this committee actually make their decisions? 12 of them come to the meeting with a research department behind them. So there are 12 research departments represented at the meeting of the, or actually 13, at the meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee, and they come with different ideas, and no doubt the presidents of the various reserve banks are influenced by what their staffs think, and no doubt their staffs are influenced by what their presidents think. So you've got a mixture there. The story of the Fed is extremely interesting. There's a wonderful book called America's Bank by Roger Lowenstein, which describes how they set up the Fed. It was very, very hard. The people who lived away from the East Coast didn't want the East Coast to dominate monetary policy. The people in agriculture didn't want industrialists to dominate the interest rate setting. They wanted nice low price, nice low interest rates. And Woodrow Wilson, preparing for his success at Versailles, was new in office, and he managed to put an agreement together which created this board, which has 12 members who are not appointed by the government, but by local committees, and 7 members, this is post-1933, and 7 members who are appointed by the President of the United States with a positive vote on them from the Congress. So I am now the Honorable Stanley Fisher, if you want to know. That's how you can distinguish me from Jacob. And if you send letters to me and you're nuts, you'd say, to the Honorable Stanley Fisher. Well, nobody in my family would know who the hell that is. So we've got these targets, and then we have a meeting. And the front of the meeting, the beginning of the meeting, 3 draft announcements are sent out to the 17, 19 members of the committee, and then a discussion takes place, not on the basis of those 3 draft announcements. You can imagine there are one to cut the interest rate, one to leave it unchanged, one to raise it. There is a discussion which is more general than that, but they will occasionally say, I prefer paragraph 3 in statement C, etc., and then it's the job of the chair to put all this together into a decision and an announcement supporting the decision. So what goes on? Well, what goes on is what's happening in the economy. And for a very long time, the interest rate setting was dominated by a fear of negative interest rates. I'm not allowed to report on what other people think in any of those meetings. The minutes will be, not the minutes, the transcripts will be published 5 years after each meeting. So I'll soon be able to read what I thought at that time. And you have this very extensive discussion, and then, like all discussions, it sort of settles down on two or three key issues. And whatever they are, you hope to get to some sort of consensus. And the Fed has a respect which, at least once I realized in my case, was being followed in the Bank of Israel, which was not unnecessarily to vote against the chairman. I mean, if you really felt strongly, you could vote against the chairman, but voting against the chairman carries a cost for the institution. It makes the chairman look weaker, and you don't do something trivial because you don't like the wording of the second last sentence on such and such a page. You have a serious disagreement with them. So that's the basis on which they vote, and there's a reason that there are so few dissents. Because if you've got a very good chairman, and all the time I was there we had an excellent chairman, they've spent a week on the phone before the meeting discussing the draft statements and saying, well, if I said Y instead of X, would you support the statement? And typically there's a Y instead of the X that would lead to support. So there's a whole pre-negotiation on these statements, and then the then the historical discussion takes place. So what are the issues that we faced during the time I was there, and I'll be talking about my attitude to them. The possibility of having a negative interest rate frightened the heck out of everybody who had to set the interest rate, because, you know, the Congress is not the House of Parliament, the British Parliament. The British Parliament, you need an agreement with the government. You speak to, at least most of the time, you speak to the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, and they say, okay, with us, that's it, you're finished. You can go and do what you want. You know you've got political, you've got political support. Well, the Congress is different. There are, I don't know, 545 or 65 members of Congress. They all want to be in the paper next day. And if they've got nothing else to criticize, they'll criticize the Fed, invent a new monetary rule, whatever. And so you're continuously under bombardment, and you can't easily reach an agreement with the Congress. And reaching those agreements and having good relations with the Congress is a very important part of the process. Now, Jacob and Karnit and I know that you do have to speak to the members of the Knesset in Israel as well. But it's not such a wearing process, such a difficult process to go through. And what really concerned people was, if we raise the interest rate, will we have to reduce it? And if we have to reduce it, will it go negative? And this led to what you can call interest rate raising aversion. It's a technical term, I just made it up. Martin actually probably suffered from this problem at some stage, but he'll speak for himself. So the interest rate was kept at between 0 and 25 basis points for several years, and they had to invent a lot of things: forward guidance, purchases of assets, etc. But whatever was done succeeded, and there was never any pressure to go negative in the United States, and I think there would be a large public aversion to going negative. So it was fortunate that we didn't get into that situation. The difficult issue lately has been, what do we do about the interest rate? The unemployment rate. Do I need to stop? Yes? All right. I already left out half, you should know. What do you do about the unemployment rate? The unemployment rate is well below what anybody thinks the target should be. So you should raise the interest rate, right? It's simple. Trouble is, we don't have a basis for knowing what the natural rate what the full employment rate of unemployment is. And every time we get to the point of do we raise the interest rate now or not, people think, well, we can do better on employment if we don't raise the interest rate. So they tend to vote not to raise the interest rate because there's no inflation. We're now getting to the United States is now getting to the point where the interest rate, where the inflation rate is getting close to its 2% target level. But it hadn't for a very long time, and that said, don't raise this. And I voted, I am allowed to say how I voted. Also, you can read the record and you can see how I voted. The record you can read is just, there's a list of dissents at the end of each decision. The I said to myself, we really have no idea what the unemployment rate should be. What we know is that 4 out of 5 of the last times, in the 4 out of 5 of the last recessions, the unemployment rate fell well below the what was regarded as a full employment rate, and they let it go. And when they eventually turned around, there was a recession. So there are some people who say, well, the history says start raising the interest rate sooner, and the other people say, yes, but look, there are these unemployed, those people, and those unemployed, these people, and so forth. We don't have to do it now. And so it goes on a while, and that was why I supported the voting for continuing to reduce the interest rate. That turned around about a year and a half ago. The last thing I'd like to discuss, because I'm being cut off prematurely here, is that there's always the question about what do you do about the rest of the world? Shouldn't you take into account that if you raise the interest rate, Turkey's going to get into trouble, or some country like that? Well, this is impossible. There will always be somebody who's going to get into trouble if you raise the interest rate. Why? Because they overborrowed in all likelihood. If anybody thought for the last 10 years that the interest rate was going to be zero forever, they were nuts. And if they based their national policies on the assumption of long-term interest rates of zero, they were nuts, and they shouldn't have done it. And I must say, I won't name countries, but there's a country which used to beat us up every day about not raising the interest rate, and eventually realized that this country has a lot of neighbors, and I guarantee you that their neighbors would be happier if the big country cut its interest rates so that they would have lower interest rates. So I thought one day I should write an article explaining why we need a particular set of countries to reduce their interest rates for the good of the developing countries. Fortunately, I haven't written it yet. So I need to stop now, apparently. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I'm very grateful to be back in Israel. I'm very grateful to be back in Israel, not as a member of the Fed. That has nothing to do with my disliking the Fed. It has to do with my disliking the questions I got asked in Israel when I was a member of the Fed. No, so are you going to raise the interest rates? מה דעתך על הנגידה? מה דעתך על ביבי? אז החלטתי שזה מספיק, אין לי מה להוסיף למה שאמרתי בפעם הקודמת, זאת אומרת, אסור לי לדבר על זה. ובזה אני עוצר ומודה לכם ומתנצל עבור excesses. Thank you.
Our next speaker is you,
Okay, thank you very much, Governor Dr. Fluck, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to be here on this extraordinary occasion and to express my gratitude to the great collaboration of my institution, Czech National Bank and Bank of Israel, for a long term, I would say, proving our generally extraordinary friendly relations between our both countries. And I am proud to have this opportunity to continue in my current incarnation this nice setup. We have a special year as well. This year we are celebrating just these days the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Czechoslovakia in 1918, and I am proud that most of our history, with certain break under the communist regime, we got extremely well relations to our friends in Israel and let me remind the help of the in late 40s and beginning of 50s training of some Israeli experts, I mean army experts, and also some delivery of the sources. So let's go to the topic. Of course, Czech Republic is a small open economy, so also in this respect we face some similar challenges. And of course, during the last 10 years, basically the crisis and after crisis years, I mean mainly Europe in this respect, we've been also under the severe pressure of the recession and the fear of declining or boosting disinflationary, even deflationary pressures. So in 2012, my predecessors came in the decreasing of interest rates as a main instrument of our monetary policy, because we are inflation targeting country already since 1998, basically to this zero lower band, and in some respects similar like Fed, we do not consider, or we consider many things at this time. My predecessors considers, because I came to the bank only 2014 in the spring, but we decided not to go into the negative territory in order to make our monetary policy setup more accommodative. The reason why we decided not to go that was really not enough experience with that, let's call it experiment. Also because the Czech banking sector, the financial sector, was at this time, has been and is still over liquid. There was no problem with the credit supply. There was a problem of real economy depression, and so there was the decision after certain time and discussions which lasted almost 1 year, since autumn 2012 to autumn 2013, including verbal intervention and so on. Finally, it was decided to use the exchange rate for temporary as a main instruments in order to get more easy monetary policy stance in conditions of a small open economy. So I will start with this now. It was November, just 5 years ago now, it's a kind of anniversary, that the board decided to devaluate or depreciate slightly the koruna from this time market rate around 5%, and was announced that we will keep this level for certain period ahead unchanged. So we will not allow to appreciate koruna through unlimited interventions on a fixed market in order to get the more accommodative monetary policy conditions. The main goals of this was the accommodation of the monetary policy, to tackle the deflationary pressures which occurs repeatedly and in getting be stronger and stronger, and of course to achieve our inflation target, which is also 2%, and to revive economy, the real economy, to help the real economy to revive. The origin thought was to keep it for a one and a half year in full force, but finally the commitment was prolonged several times, mainly due to the external reasons, because at the same time, if you remember, 2014, there was a significant supply side shock by dropping down the commodity prices, mainly the oil, and of course, Czech economy being very open, industry-based export economy was impacted by this quite significantly. So yeah, in our case, this using of FX commitment, as we call it, it was a form of our monetary easing, our monetary expansion, and basically we join in this respect many other developed economies. The interventions, of course, in the beginning there was necessary intervention to get the requested level of the FX rate. Later on, more than 1.5 years, there was no necessary to intervene at all. It was enough to keep our promise and our say forward guidance that we will not allow to Corona to appreciate. Of course, later on, once we started to approach more or less expected exit from the regime, the interest of the market to invest into the Corona with expectations that after once we will leave the FX regime, the Corona will appreciate back, grew up. As well, so the intervention came into the active force once again, and in the autumn 2016 was already more or less clear that the moment of the exit is coming. We try to avoid the so-called, let's say, Swiss example of the exit, because as you know, probably it was not very easy for the market and as well for the central bank. So we decided to be very open, transparent and clear, and we set up the so-called hard commitment to the date, the last date till which we do not under any conditions will leave the commitment, FX commitment. It was set, it was the end of the first quarter of the 2017. So of course it's also somehow accelerate the interest of the market to invest into the Corona. So the interventions went up significantly this last phase of the FX commitment regime. Finally, we assess the situation that the goals of this temporary extraordinary regime was achieved. First of all, the inflation recovered and started to be firmly close to our target. At the same time, the Czech economy recovered significantly. Despite the previous crisis time, the Czech economy was one of the most harmed in the region. We've been even more affected than some of our neighbors, partially because the openness of the economy, partially because some mistake in the fiscal policy, which was at this time probably too restrictive. So we decided to leave the regime. It was in the beginning of the April 2017, and basically the leave from this commitment was for us the first step towards subsequent normalizing of the monetary policy stance. For some observers, maybe unexpectedly, the exit went very smooth. Corona appreciated as we accepted, as we supposed, around 5-6% in next 12 months. But later on, it means that basically the spring of this year, when the global turmoil on the market started to occur. The appreciation was stopped. There was even slight depreciation, which brings us, I would say, window of opportunity to continue with the normalizing of the monetary policy stance, also through our main and standard instrument, which are the which are the interest rates. So since this time, we already hiked, as you see from this graph, from this picture or from this slide, 7 times already. So we are looking like running very quickly, but it's really very subsequent hiking by 0.25 basis points each time, and still, as you see, the last hike was last week, so it's quite new. At the moment, our basic rate is 1.75, so something which in the past we would assess as very low interest rates for economy of our type, but you know, today compared to Eurozone or some other of our neighbors, it looks like very a bit extraordinary. But what we are doing and why we are doing that, because all the indicators which are for us decisive, which is mainly the inflation and also the economy output, unemployment, are really a sign of slightly overheating economy. According to our assessment, we are slightly or more or less above the potential of the economy. Unemployment is extremely low. Maybe you know the Czech Republic for a long time has the lowest unemployment rate in the whole European Union. Basically, there's a total shortage of labor force. So labor market is pushed by the of course by the workers. It also caused a significant increase in wages. Wages are growing 8-7 in bill, even if we total wage bill, even double-digit growth because increase of the employment. So in such an environment, we see as necessary to continue to normalize the monetary policy stand, and thanks to the certain relax coming from the global market to the emerging currencies, including Corona, we have this opportunity to continue, and we will probably continue this way also next quarters. Of course, we are looking very closely and observing the giant next to us, which is a Eurozone, which is of course very important for us, but the domestic relations are the most driver for our domestic monetary policy. If you like, you can see that from the graphical perspective. This is very easy combination of how we set up the monetary conditions. The horizontal axis is interest rates. The y-axis is exchange rate. Our colleagues from research department did also some research on the results of our FX commitment, and according their results, they use to approach how to assess the experience with the FX commitment to the Czech economy. On both of these, the results are relatively very positive. So according our experience, the exchange rate in small open economy, it really works. The pass-through is quick and relatively intensive. Of course, is a question of how far and how deep you can use this extraordinary instrument. So concluding, our experience with these specific unorthodox monetary policy is quite positive, and of course, as I said, it's always a question of how, if this experience is repeatedly possible to use in a shorter term or something like that. That's, I am not sure. But in this very extraordinary situation which we experienced during the crisis years, it worked relatively well. What is the most important lesson for us? It's to be prepared for that on the communication side very, very closely. We did a lot of mistake in the beginning, and it was not easy to communicate. Central bank was heavily criticized by politicians, by many stakeholders, including, of course, unions, even employers. So it was the big lessons that using this extraordinary instrument needs well communication-wise preparation in ahead. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.
Our next speaker is Dolphin, who represents Brazil, going through completely different experience.
Let me just find the presentation. I'm glad that I'm here, so we have space there. Well, good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure and an honor. A pleasure for several reasons. Coming back to Israel, speaking Hebrew again, meeting friends, family. Second, it's a pleasure not to enter a cab. Nobody knows who I am. Nobody asked me about the economy. It's perfect. And third, it is a pleasure to be in the farewell of Kainit. We have been enjoying conversations every 2 months. I don't know if you know, we have this club where we meet every 2 months and we cry our difficulties to each other. So we also met in some conference. So I hope we continue to meet internationally. It is an honor because Governor Flug has done such a wonderful job, and I think we owe her a thank you, Toda Rabba Kainit, for the state of Israel and for everybody else. Well, the case of Brazil is interesting. Inflation targeting. We never have a dull moment. It started, as usual, when everything else failed. We had a fixed exchange regime. The IMF helped us. You know who was the first deputy managing director of the IMF when we established inflation targeting 20 years ago? The Honorable Stanley Fischer. So he helped us. And here is around, let me tell you the record. This is the inflation targeting in the last 20 years. You see the peaks. The first peak was very high. This was the first change in government from previous government with a social democrat to a more social democrat but more lefty. The markets were very concerned. At the end of the day, you saw the exchange rate depreciating quite a bit, and that had an impact on inflation. In Brazil, crisis of confidence leads the central bank to face higher inflation and lower output. It's not what central banks hope for, and it happened several times. The second time you see was in 2000, recently, in 2014-15, where again you had a confidence crisis, again coming from the political arena, where you had an impeached president, and again the markets were very anxious about what will happen next. You got depreciation, you got inflation, and you got a recession. The interesting point is why this is not happening now. Well, I don't know exactly, but I have the explanations where it looks better for us at the central bank. One of them is that expectations are quite important in terms of inflation. If you are there and you somehow convince not only the taxi drivers but everybody else that set prices that you will be there to not let prices increase. So here are expectations, 1 year ahead expectations, and as you see in the other two phenomena, we got inflation above the upper limit of the target. We have a target, and when you pass a certain amount, which is 4%, if you pass 4.5%, if you pass 6.5%, then you have to write a letter, public letter, explaining how you're going to return. If you're going below that, you also have to write a letter. I had the pleasure and unpleasure to write a letter because inflation was below the target for the first time in years. But you see that expectations remain around the target. I will say that one of the slides that I'm most proud of is this one. Maybe I'm just proud and there's nothing to do with our jobs, but at least that's how we tell the stories to ourselves. Here is inflation in this January, in this 2015-16. Inflation went all the way to almost 11%. Remember, the target is 4.5%. All the way to 11%. And expectations for the future at the beginning of 2016 were around 8%. This is the dotted line. At a specific point in time, beginning of 2016. 6 months later, actually 7 months later, the expectations were already much closer to the target at 5%. The change in the direction of policies, the change in terms of the commitment helped change the expectations 12 months, 24 months going ahead to 5%. At the end, actual inflation, which is not the dotted lines, which is the solid lines, where it was actually below the expectations. And now we have inflation at our 4.2, which is the target for 2019. And the expectations continue to be at around 4.2%, even though there was quite a bit of a depreciation this year coming from the external scenario. As you all know, external environment for emerging markets is more difficult at the time. I will talk about it a little bit. Both the normalization of policies in the US and trade disputes have made emerging markets world a bit more challenging. What is happening in emerging markets? Two things. One is monetary policy normalization, and the other is trade conflict, like China-US, NAFTA debates. I will say that the first issue, which is also a common shock, the monetary policy normalization should not be a factor that the emerging markets will complain. Normalization is normal. It should be part of our landscape. If you got zero interest rate, you won't be for zero forever. At some point, it will normalize. If it was not normalized, you should not call it normal. Trade conflicts, on top of that, are a bit of a stretch, because on a moment where you have normalization, you are having trade conflicts which are not supposed to happen. At the same time, and this is where you get a little bit more tensions as you pass. It is a common shock, but the impact on each economy depends on its own fundamentals and its own buffers. And what is important, that once the shock hits you, it is what you have done before is what counts, and not what you are exactly doing now or you're going to do. So the buffers you created, so for example, you can mention countries, but the most affected this year were countries with large current account deficits, large debts in dollars, small reserves. Second factor is that countries that are more affected somehow did not have the de facto independence, autonomy of the central banks. When you fiddle with the central bank, it is quite, markets react quite strongly. Third, fiscal space, which in the case of Brazil we are still struggling, which we have not done before, and that's part of what needs to be done. Reforms, adjustments, you have to continue to do the reforms, although you had to do them before. So what do you do once the emerging markets are affected as this year? Well, for the advanced economies, communicate well the normalization, which in my view has been communicated in advance in quite a clear way, which I don't think it is the issue. Nobody should be surprised. Resolve the trade conflicts. This is where there is room to do, because that will create a bit of more of a space for everybody. What about the emerging markets? Well, defense against shocks start on the domestic front. Policy framework like floating exchange regimes, really floating, inflation targeting with flexibility. The first graph I showed you, sometimes inflation goes up, but the commitment to go down is crucial to return, and that's what gives inflation targeting the flexibility, but also the direction once the shock hits you. What about the buffers? Once again, reserves are important. I know there's a debate in our country, in Brazil. There is a debate about the level of reserves. In Brazil, we have 20% of GDP in reserves. Every time there's a calm, people say we have too much reserves. Once you get the shock, people say we have too low reserves. And then we go to the next phase, and they say we have too much. And here's the debate. Reserves are costly, but they are self-insurance. Anchored inflation expectations. It was quite useful in the case of Brazil this year to have an inflation a little bit below the target so that we have some room. It was important to have anchored expectations. And finally, it is important to continue in the direction of reforms and adjustments so that you can signal the markets that you are doing your job to get better. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Deputy Governor Flog.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, thank you very much. It's a great honor also for me to be here in this conference. As Nadine said, the Swedish Riksbank and the Bank of Israel has a long tradition of cooperating and talking to each other. And it's cooperation and friendship that we appreciate a lot. So I'm very pleased to be here in the honor of Governor Flug. Also, I think the two central banks, is my observation at least, have faced very similar challenges in the years after the global financial crisis. So I will say a few words about the experiences from Sweden with unconventional monetary policy, and I will focus on the time period from 2015 and onwards. But first, just notice some of the similarities. So obviously, both Sweden and Israel are small economies. We have very similar size of the population. We have inflation targets and floating exchange rates. We depend a lot on trade with other countries, and our monetary policies are also very much affected by the exchange rate movements. Both countries also shared the similarity that Sweden was hit rather severely in 2008 and 2009. We had a big drop in GDP, sharper than in Israel, I think. But except for that, after that time period, growth has been rather strong in both countries. So we haven't had a clear lack of domestic demand in any of the countries. So in the graph to the right, I illustrate the development for Sweden, the dark blue line, compared to the Euro area and United States. As you see, GDP from 2007 and onwards has grown roughly to the same extent in Sweden as in the United States. Slightly less, I think, than in Israel, but the normal growth level in Sweden, I think, is also a bit lower than in Israel. But both countries, although we've had healthy or rather rapid growth, and in Sweden for at least the last few years, high resource utilization, inflation has been a problem. It has been problematically low, and we both responded with rather expansionary, often unconventional monetary policies. At the same time, we've also been struggling with the trade-off of problems on financial markets, or in particular household debt and housing markets. So in Sweden, we have for many years, I could say for several decades, been worried by rapid growth in housing prices and household debt. In Sweden, just to illustrate where we were in 2014, late 2014, early 2015, when we went into the most expansionary part of the monetary policy, inflation had already been falling for 5 years and been clearly below the inflation target. And inflation expectations were also falling. There was clear downward trend that accelerated in late 2014. There was also a broader discussion in the Swedish economy about initially about the Riksbank not focusing enough on fulfilling the inflation target, and then about the impossibility of ever getting inflation back up, etc. So what did we do in Sweden then? Well, in early 2015, we cut the repo rate, our policy rate, from 0 to negative territory, to -0.1 to begin with. We also initiated a quantitative easing program, purchasing government bonds. 1 year later, we also started to communicate about FX interventions. We never did actually intervene in the foreign exchange market. But we said from January 2016 and onwards that we had a special preparedness to intervene if necessary. And we also did a lot of forward guidance and communication, but that I don't view as unconventional for the Riksbank. We did a lot of that also before the global financial crisis. So we publish a forecast for our repo rate, for example. I should say also that in contrast to what Stan said about the Fed, in Sweden we published the transcripts from the monetary policy meetings, not 5 years after the meeting, but roughly 2 weeks after the meeting. So it's a very quick process with accountability, which makes us all aware of our individual responsibilities for the decisions. So we have a tradition actually of not always agreeing. We often have dissents in the committee. And I've dissented to quite a bit of what we've done here. I entered reservations about all the steps that we took in terms of communication about FX intervention. I objected to, so what you can see here in the graph, when I came to the Riksbank in 2013, the repo rate was 1%. We had this rather controversial time period in 2010 and onwards. Someone mentioned Lars Svensson, my predecessor in the Monetary Policy Committee. It was a very controversial time period when the Riksbank raised the repo rate in 7 consecutive meetings, just as the Czechs have recently done. And afterwards, we're not very quick in reducing the repo rate. So there is still a discussion about this time period, Was it a wise thing to do, and why did it happen? Is this discussion about leaning against financial imbalances, but I think the rate increases were also driven by the rapid recovery in the Swedish economy and more optimism than turned out to be realistic once the European debt crisis materialized. So it's easy to say with the benefit of hindsight that this was a mistake. Can debate how much a mistake it was in real time. But anyway, when I came to the bank in 2013, I argued for more rapid rate decreases. I thought at that time it was obvious that we had an inflationary problem, too little inflation. Then I've also objected to the last step that we took down to -0.5. I thought we should have stopped at -0.35. I've objected to the last parts of the QE program also, which I thought would not be very efficient. But anyway, although I have very often enter reservations, I think broadly speaking, I have agreed, and we have had a common view on this in the executive board in the last 5 years, that this is roughly the monetary policy that has been necessary, and that it has also worked and been efficient. So let me say a few words about what happened. To begin with, it worked very well, I think. The negative policy rate had a rather normal transmission into other interest rates. To the left, we see 2-year government bond rates. We had a time period when we raised the repo rate more rapidly than the ECB, and the other banks like the Fed didn't raise the rate at all. Our two-year government bond yields increased above what happened in other countries. Over the last few years, we've had roughly the same monetary policy stance as in Germany. And if you look at the transmission to lending rates, at least when we went down to -0.35, we had a more or less perfect one-to-one response on lending rates both to household mortgages and to firms. You can debate whether the very final step had an effect at all. But clearly the transmission was relatively normal. Deposit rates for households, though, they were stuck at 0 as we had expected. So there is an accumulated a little bit of a tension between deposits and lending rates. I'll get back to that in the next slide, I think. So what happened then to inflation expectations and inflation? Well, it increased. Inflation is back close to 2%, actually a little bit above 2% because of high energy prices, I should say. And inflation expectations are back to roughly 2%. So there is a discussion now about, well, why don't you raise the rate? Isn't it time to do it? Actually, I voted for an interest rate increase in our last meeting, but the majority view was that we should still wait. I guess this is the, what did you call it, Stan? The inflation increase aversion, yes. Interest rate increase aversion, right. We still live, I guess, with experiences from the last time that we increased the repo rate and then had to cut back again. And we, of course, we don't want to get back into the same kind of problems again. So it's a matter of assessing how much confidence do we have in that the credibility for monetary policy is restored or not. I guess I'm a little bit more confident that we are back to a rather good situation than a majority of my colleagues. But the difference is not big, I should say. So as I said, negative rates had a clear positive impact. There were also few technical problems. The banking system didn't suffer. The Swedish banks are very profitable. Lending to households, we've been worried that it's growing too rapidly. Lending to firms has increased and expanded during this time period. I would say that the largest negative side effect has been communication. It has been a challenge to communicate what we are doing, why we are doing it, what it means to have a negative interest rate, and why is this necessary when we have a good development in the real side of the economy. About QE, to save some time, I will not get into this, but you can debate whether it actually has had an effect in Sweden or not, in addition to actually reducing short interest rates. Sweden is very different. The setting is very different, both from the US and the European setting. The communication, the open mouth intervention that we've done in the FX market, I think has been rather effective. The krona, which we have always evaluated to be, or assessed to be undervalued, not overvalued from a long-term structural perspective, has not appreciated. Actually, it has depreciated in this time period. As I said, I've objected to this communication because I think it's not really part of the rules of the game for a small open economy with a floating exchange rate and inflation target and the exchange rate not being overvalued to work with FX interventions if your neighboring countries are not in a better situation to handle the problems that you would export if you did FX interventions. But that's my minority view in the Riksbank. So the final slide, as I said already, there has been a lot of debate over the last decade about monetary policy in Sweden. You can debate or discuss how much transparency should you have surrounding monetary policy. We try to be extremely transparent in the Riksbank. I think that's a good thing, but you then have to live, I think, with the debate that evolves. One of the things that we struggle with now is that people complain that we are not flexible enough. We are too focused on inflation. I would say that all central banks are, of course, flexible inflation targeters. It doesn't really matter if you have a dual mandate or just a price stability mandate, as Stan already said. But you cannot be very flexible if you don't have credibility for your inflation target. Flexibility is only possible if you have a strong credibility for the target, so that inflation almost automatically moves towards the target eventually, even if you temporarily focus on something else. So the question today is, do we have sufficient credibility for the target to become a bit more flexible again or not? The FX communication I already said. And finally, a question that I don't really have an answer to, but I think is relevant both for Sweden and Israel, is how independent can monetary policy actually be in a small open economy with a floating exchange rate? How much do we have to mimic or almost mimic what the big neighbors are doing? My guess to an answer is that we can be rather independent. It depends a lot on the kind of credibility that you have, which need not be the same as for your neighboring big central banks. And also small deviations from what the other countries are doing can have a rather large impact on developments in your own country. So it's not that the Riksbank is just copying what other central banks are doing. Okay, thank you. I stop there.
Our next speaker, back Nadine.
אתה יכול למצוא לי את הזה? אוקיי, יופי, מצאתי, תודה. Thank you, Asaf. So good afternoon again. And this is the case, of course, of the Israeli economy, and monetary policy is much more familiar to the people sitting in the audience. So I'll try to make it still understandable also to our guests from abroad. I mentioned in the introduction that during the period of, during the tenure of Governor Flug, we had despite the F performance, that grade that Ruben gave us, that we had a fairly good performance, at least with respect to the real economic activity. And I want to suggest to you that positive economic developments and positive shocks, whether they're, for instance, the discovery of large reserves of national gas, or whether there are more vigorous price competition in industries that had been concentrated, these positive shocks can bring challenges to monetary policy that are just as complex and difficult as those presented by negative shocks. And in part, our experience is similar to the experience of both the Czech and the Swedish and also the Swiss economy. So let me briefly remind ourselves of what were these positive developments that we saw. If you look at the economic growth, I mean, clearly you can see that during that period, as I mentioned, economic growth was fairly favorable. On average, it's 3.6% of GDP. But if you look at the quarterly fluctuations, you can see that we had periods where these quarterly fluctuations in a few times gave us time to ponder as to, was this really going to continue? And it's certainly, again, for a forward-looking policymaker, this gave rise to vigorous discussions in the committee. Nevertheless, we could see that at least the labor market figures were positive. You can see that the participation rate of the labor force increased while the unemployment rate decreased throughout the period. The increase in the participation rate has in part to do, of course, with this morning discussions, and we saw indeed that particularly it was the labor rate participation of Arab women that increased, but not only. So we could see we had a strong labor market. As Stan just told us as well, it's never clear where the floor is, and indeed we hadn't seen such a low unemployment rate in Israel, and we'd never seen such a high participation rate in Israel. So it wasn't clear to us either whether we had reached bottom there. Nominal wages were rising, and they still are rising at about 3% a year, which we think is quite solid growth, even though it's far from the 7 or 8% that the Czech Republic has been enjoying. But clearly this shows, again, that the general economic environment in terms of the labor market was fairly positive. And all this was happening while the inflation in Israel was quite low. In fact, if you look, and here you have 2010 to 2018 inflation rate. In green, you can see the median inflation for OECD countries, and then the thicker band shows the plus minus 25% around the median. I mean, we had, by and large, a better real economic performance than most OECD countries. And yet, the reduction in inflation, which occurred also everywhere, was much deeper in Israel. And in fact, we find ourselves not only below our inflation target, but we found ourselves in negative territory for almost 3 years. Now, this was an unusual constellation of economic facts that presented a new challenge to the Monetary Policy Committee. And again, as I mentioned, it was a challenge that we shared with some other small open economies like the Czech, the Swedes, and the Swiss economy. In fact, I often would start a presentation saying I never thought I'd be making a comparison between the Swiss and the Israeli economy. But it turned out to have been, relevant. So we pondered greatly and at length in trying to understand this low level of inflation, understanding inflation dynamics, the transmission mechanism, the elusive figure, and I'll come back to that, of the equilibrium exchange rate in the economy, the dynamics of the FX market, the cost of being behind, of being in front of the curve, and structural changes that may be affecting the inflation and the inflation dynamics, open mouth operations and every word we weighed, and so on. Our tolerance with the low inflation, I think, surprised some, and in fact, it also exacerbated others. Some people called for much more vigorous, aggressive monetary policy. Surprisingly, often these same pundits now complain about our tolerance to watching the interest rate rise in the US without following them quickly. One of the things that reassured us was that even though we had a protracted low interest rate, and I'll come back to that, was the fact that the overall level of leverage in the economy was not rising very much. Here you have on the left-hand side the public sector debt as a percentage of GDP, the corporate sector debt as a percentage of GDP in blue, and on the right-hand side, the total household debt as a percentage of GDP, and part of it of mortgages. Roughly what you can see is that throughout the period, the corporate sector debt was slightly falling or constant. The public sector debt continued to fall as a burden, and the household debt was increasing, but it was increasing fairly moderately. In fact, it was increasing in line with the increase in employment and the increase in nominal wages. So that, that, if you want, overall financial environment, I think gave us also more time to ponder on these very low inflation rate. So we ask, so clearly some of the questions that we ask, and I'll say a few things about how much of this low inflation was transitory, how much was due to external factors. Price stability in Israel is defined as top-line inflation. I mean, how much should we look through these shocks? How long can inflation be so low while our nominal wages are rising? I mean, at some point you would expect it should have an impact. To what extent might long-term structural changes be impacting on the inflation levels? And should monetary policy response be symmetric when faced with below target inflation as opposed to above target rates? We often had discussions around that. And as I mentioned, is this protracted period of low interest rate jeopardizing financial stability? So let me say a few things about some of these issues. One is clearly we were quite aware that there were transitory shocks that pushed inflation in negative territory for almost 3 years. And by the way, we do not have in Israel a core inflation figure, even though we had, by the way, excellent work that was done in the past by Sigal Ribon and some other colleagues in the research department that tried to see whether we could have a better core inflation measure that would be a better indicator to understand inflation dynamics, and we didn't find there were any of those. But nevertheless, during this period, clearly the most obvious external and particularly supply shocks we could take out of the CPI. So if we take out, for instance, fruits and vegetables, in Israel there's very few imports of fruits and vegetables, so that therefore increases a lot our monthly volatility. The fact that oil prices had dropped dramatically, so we took energy prices out. And then there were a series of, in part, reforms, but also regulated prices by the government that were decreased during that period. For instance, electricity prices, water prices, there was a reduction in VAT of 1% at some point. So trying to take all of these things out, then we could see, okay, so what does perhaps our underlying inflation rate looks like? So what you can see here, well, the blue line, as I mentioned, was almost for 3 years in negative territory. The green line, which is the CPI excluding these obviously supply shocks, in fact, was quite above that. At some point, a lot above that. But it was still quite low. It was still below our target range. Our target range is between 1 and 3. And even when we corrected for all of these things, we still had an inflation that was below our target range. And still today, it's at 0.8%, even though the top line is now at 1.2%. We did also, a substantial amount of work was done in the research department, particularly by Itamar Caspi of the research department, on the external factors. To what extent had external factors impacted on this low level of inflation. And indeed, it was clear that part of our low level of inflation was part of a global phenomenon. We were in part importing those deflationary forces. We're clearly also aware that the continued strengthening of the shekel was making it difficult, of course, for inflation to rise. And here you have the shekel, the nominal effective exchange rate, and we had many discussions, and we still do, about what the appropriate nominal effective exchange rate should be. But if you look here with a basket, quite a broad basket of currencies, but clearly the shekel, the dollar and the euro are particularly important there, you can see that the shekel was roughly strengthening throughout the period. This will, and I will return to that thorny issue of whether it was excessive strengthening of the shekel or whether it was just reflecting the fact that the Israeli economic fundamentals were doing better than a lot of our trading partners. We were facing strong headwind from the expansionary monetary policy abroad. Of course, the low interest rates in the US, the negative rates in Europe, the negative rates in Japan, and the rates are only part of the monetary expansion, of course, of these countries. There was QE. A lot of the small open economies, as we heard, were also intervening quite aggressively in the FX market in order to avoid the strengthening of the currency, again, facing something similar to what we were facing. Now, by the way, and I'm not sure, I do have the graph, I wasn't sure. By the way, the effectiveness of our low interest rate, we know was to some extent limited by the fact that historically in Israel, we've always had a fairly steep yield curve. So when you look at the other countries that were also trying to, if you want, increase their inflation rate, they kept their short-term rates low, but they also had fairly flat yield curves. So therefore, they were enjoying, in part because of QE, not necessarily, but in part because of QE. So they were enjoying, if you want, an expansionary monetary policy where the transmission mechanism could go through all along the curve. In Israel, historically, and I won't go into that because this would be a completely different discussion, but in Israel, we've always had a fairly steep curve. And you can see that, briefly, by the way, only Italy for the moment has a steeper curve than that of Israel's. If you take the spread between the 10-year and the 1-year bond in Israel, Israel will be the blue sort of double line there. You can see roughly we're above most other countries. And by the way, many of these countries had even lower short-term rates. If you take, of course, a country like Germany, they have even negative rates, and yet they have an even flatter curve. So the effectiveness, if you want, to what extent was our monetary policy expansionary? It's true we had a low interest rate, but it wasn't kept low for very long, if you want, along the curve. So one of the things that we, of course, worried about was having, a persistently low inflation level. To what extent was this impacting on inflation dynamics, and to what extent particularly was it impacting on inflation expectations? When you can see here on the graph, the yellow line is the inflation expectation. One of the things is that short-term inflation expectation went indeed way below our target, although they never came down so much as to be in the negative territory where inflation, remember, where top-line inflation was at 3%. It was true if we look at inflation expectation. It was true if we looked at most of the analysts who were forecasting. That is, when we were looking at the various analysis and forecasts, both internally and externally, most of the time we could see inflation returning to the bottom of our target range within a year or so. So inflation, the 1-year inflation expectation, although for a while was quite below our target range, On the other hand, if you look at longer terms inflation expectation, if you look at forwards between 2 to 3 years or 3 to 5 years, or the 5 to 10 years, the really long-term inflation, this was very much anchored within the target range, and the long-term around the 2%, which clearly has to do with what Stan said early on. If the whole world is at 2%, presumably we ought to be at 2% as well. And that is also, I think, a belief that the central bank will make an effort to keep it within that range. Now, an additional backdrop was to the social and economic tapestry of the country, if you want, was that everyone was quite aware that the cost of living in Israel still is significantly higher than in comparable countries. And I don't know whether our guests will have time to travel around, but if you do, you'll find that Israel is a pretty expensive place. The loud and the persistent social outcry encouraged the successive governments to undertake reforms in notably concentrated sectors in order to increase competition and thus price reductions. This is, of course, a very welcome structural change in the economy. And clearly, the Monetary Policy Committee did not see its role as trying to compensate for these reductions in prices. And here, another perhaps element which also added to a positive structural change was, of course, the fact that, with the internet shopping taking on, then not only price comparison, but really competition, particularly from abroad, that also put a brake to potential price increases. So monetary policy in a nutshell was doing three things. One, we kept interest rate low, and they're still there for 3.5 years at 0.1%. We intervened in the foreign exchange market, and I'll say a few things about the intervention in the FX market. And we also started at some point to provide forward guidance. The foreign exchange intervention, by the way, there are at least two arguments not to intervene in the FX market. One of them is it's not effective. You're not going to be able to counter an appreciation of the shekel. And the other one, you should not, because the markets know what they're doing. And the exchange rate that you're seeing is the appropriate equilibrium exchange rate. So we spent, and the research department spent, a lot of time researching, indeed, what looks like an appropriate level of effective real exchange rate. And we did two things. One, and the work by Amit Friedman, Sigal Ribon, and Itamar Caspi helped understand to what extent were our FX intervention effective in the FX market. And what we saw was indeed it was effective, but it would wane within a few months. So that reassured us that when, in fact, we intervene in the market, apparently this was having, at least in the short term, an impact, which was important to break what we often saw as a momentum, a misguided momentum in the market. If the momentum was well guided, we would not have intervened. The research department also spent a fair amount of time and energy in trying to identify the equilibrium range of an effective exchange rate. And we became quite convinced that for various periods, we deviated substantially from that equilibrium rate. And that's another reason why we decided to intervene, because this clearly showed that the exchange rate was excessively overvalued, in which case it pushed prices down artificially. We introduced forward guidance, in fact, when the rates started to rise in the US. When the rates started to rise in the US, there were expectations in Israel that we would soon follow suit. And we therefore found that it was important to remind the markets and the public that even though the developments abroad have an impact on the developments. Our eyes are on the developments at home and not on what is happening abroad. And again, recently we've seen the inflation rise in Israel, and the last interest rate decision presided by Governor Flug, I think there were some thoughts that perhaps just before she left, she would want to change the interest rate stance. Again, Governor Flug remained true to herself, guided only by professional integrity, and she led the discussion in exactly the same way she had done during the previous 56 decisions, except for the cake. We did bring cake. Looking forward to normalization, we mentioned that last time that not all conditions were yet met to justify a change in the interest rate. Some fear that the Bank of Israel may not have the necessary tools to mitigate the down cycle when that one appears, if we keep the interest rate too low. There is some expectations that we should increase rate in order to build ammunition whenever needed when we hit the down cycle. Here I'd like to stress two things. First is that the nominal interest rate level is not an ammunition. The ammunition you need, if you need to stimulate economic activity, is going to be to have a low real interest rate, not a low nominal interest rate. So if anything, the ammunition we should build is to have higher inflation levels. So that's something which I think should be remembered. When we look at the path that inflation has taken over the past 12 months, we can see it has been rising. We can see the road has been pretty bumpy, and it may not be smooth ahead either. So we'll respond in a way that won't jeopardize the continued path to within the target. And second, I should remind people who may be afraid that we won't have enough ammunition that the interest rate decision is not the only ammunition that central banks have. So, as I mentioned, positive developments have presented exciting challenges for the Bank of Israel. And it's important, one of them has been how important it is not only to hold the interest rate low, but to try to explain that policy. And by the way, it takes as much work, integrity, and at times courage. My husband often asks me, what do I do at work, given that the interest rate has been the same for 3.5 years? But it takes as much, as I mentioned, sometimes courage to hold the rates as to change interest rates to get a headline. Thank you.
Speaker is Jacob. As you know, Jacob is a citizen of the world for the last decade, and he'll give us the global overview of what has happened.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a delight to be here. As Ilan started, it's a privilege and honor. Being the last is a challenge because everything was said. And my only consolation is that not everyone has said it. So I will also say. And it is indeed a great honor to be here back in the family of the Bank of Israel. And when I say family, I really mean it. It is what has been shown here is the relay race, passing the baton. And you know, when you have a relay race, מרוץ שליחים בעברית, everyone is trying to do his best, and yet it is the team here, intertemporal team, that actually creates the ultimate outcome. And it's a huge responsibility for everyone, knowing that the rest of the team is thinking in the same way. So it is really fantastic to be here in the same room with Stan and Karnit, and of course all the other friends that are visiting here today. Stanley mentioned his encounter with a taxi driver. So let me tell you, it must have been the same taxi driver, because when I came, he told me, "Hi, Yankele Neyman." You have listened today to a panorama of the world, and yet, of experiences, and yet, different as they are, there is so much commonality. And the challenges are similar. The answers may be a little different, but really they are the same. I remember many years ago in the early 90s when traditionally I had a little debate with the Minister of Finance. And of course the arbitrator always was Rabin, the Prime Minister. And one day he went to the US, and I told him, "Why don't you talk to the chairman of the Fed, and you will see if am I really crazy or not." And he came back and said, "You know what? כולכם מדברים את אותו דבר. All of you say the same thing." So he went to Greenspan and heard probably the same story. The point is that when you look at things in a professional way, you get a very, very common view, and this is indeed very encouraging. I must say, however, in 1991, when we introduced inflation targeting in Israel, life was very different. In a way, superficially, much simpler. Much simpler because of the fact that the governor knew, or the central bank knew, it has to achieve a target. The target was well defined. It was a path. Occasionally we needed to revise it, but that's basically it. The capital market was underdeveloped, foreign exchange controls were in place, and there was no place for tsunamis to come as they have emerged subsequently with the opening up, and therefore the challenges are different, but fundamentally the concepts are the same. If you ask me what are the main things that are robust, it is central bank independence. And independence not in the sense that we heard from our friend from Sweden, that we don't have too many degrees of freedom because we are part of a bigger whole. That's market situation. Independence from unwarranted political pressure. That's what we mean by central bank independence, and that's what is so critical to maintain. Rain or shine, we should not take things for granted. One of the things that I worry about is that many of the countries have had it too easy, so to speak, because of the fact that the infrastructure for stability was laid over many years, and therefore one can take it for granted. In the last crisis, in the most recent one, which lasted much longer than what people expected, the source was the financial sector. The source was weak banking sector. The source was low capital in the banks, over leverage, too much liquidity, etc. And many new regulations came in place, occasionally with the wrong motivations, but occasionally with good motivations. The danger now is that one confuses the number of regulations with the quality of regulations. And we should be very careful not to dismantle all the protective devices that were created to prevent the tsunami from before. Let me now take you and respond, therefore, to the assignment that was given to me by Reuven. And the context is the meeting that of the IMF that some of us participated 2 weeks ago in Bali, Indonesia. And central bank governors and ministers have presented the graph of the world. And you see the growth of the world and you see there that the world has been growing. There was a terrible year, the year of the crisis, 2008, 9, where growth of the world stalled. And if you went to industrial countries, it was even more pronounced. 2009, growth was negative 3.3%. But by and large, if you look at it, the Martian who came down to Earth for a visit will say, wow, recovery is there. Everything is nothing but perfect. Look at it. There was 1 year of aberration. Well, then he looks at the panoramic view of the world and he says, he sees in this chart two things. Number one, there is a great correlation. We are all in the same ocean. But number two, some countries are doing systematically better than others in terms of growth. And this is just an illustration that over the past quite a few years, the emerging markets have done much better than the industrial world, and within the emerging markets, Asia. And we ask ourselves, why did the last crisis spare some groups of countries, especially Southeast Asia and the like, and did not spare some others? And I think that Ilan gave the answer. Asia had the luck of having the Asian financial crisis in '97. Israel had the luck of having some crisis before. Latin America had the luck of having some crisis before. Some have learned the lesson, some not. But the important thing, therefore, is it's not the nature of the crisis, but rather have you built enough robustness in your financial system, which is really the sine qua non. Given this, GFC has become now acronym Great Financial Crisis. So given this, we have to ask ourselves, so what has happened? What we can see, and this is the chart that already our friend Reuven showed us, that with the emergence of the crisis, all central banks have lowered rates close to zero. So I would say they all entered the ocean at the same time. I mention it because down the road I will tell you they don't exit the ocean at the same time. And if you don't exit the ocean at the same time, you should be ready to see different patterns than what you saw when you entered the oceans together. So you can see here that the English-speaking countries of the large industrial world have started to raise interest rates, whether it is the US or Canada. The rest are not yet. And why? Is it because they don't know to read English? No. There were some other reasons. The important point to note is, as you look at the chart, you see that real interest rate, and that's what really matters, in the developed markets have been and are negative for a very long period of time. Think about it in terms of the nature of equilibrium that is generated by it. And we will move on to say, however, in response to the fact that the economies have not yet fully recovered when interest rates were pushed already to zero, the question was, what ammunition should I use? And Nadine already told us, there are other instruments of policy, and indeed, let's focus on the QEs of the various varieties, quantitative easing. So you can see that in the US, there was QE1, QE2, QE3, and from 2014 practically to the present, that's the top line, the size of the balance sheet of the Fed has remained stable. There is no more expansion there, even though interest rates were remaining at zero for most of that period. By the same token, if you look at Europe, you can see that in fact during the period between 2012 and 14, the size of the balance sheets of the ECB has declined. And you ask why? Well, one of the reasons is that there the mechanism allowed in fact the banks to determine the size of the balance sheet of the ECB, because the banks were allowed to return the loans to the ECB. It doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is, if the central bank wants to increase liquidity in the economic system, it needs to ask, how do I bring it about? In Japan, they needed to wait until Abe came to power, and only then really the expansion took place in the mid-2012. So as you look at it now, you can see that the size of the balance sheets of the central banks of the world is now at about $15 trillion, And the question is it a problem? Isn't it a problem? What can be done about it, etc.? One thing is clear. If the major central banks are going to insist on reducing significantly the size of their balance sheets, this will bring to world recession. There is no question about it. So therefore, the issue is not what is the size of the balance sheet, but what are the macro consequences of it, and what do we mean by normalization? And I'm going to focus on this in a minute. But what you can see, it's not just the size of the balance sheet, it is the composition of the balance sheet. In the textbooks that you all studied in the first year undergraduate, you said that the central bank typically has in the asset side of its balance sheet the best high quality assets, very liquid, very deep market, normally government treasury bills, etc. And this was the story. In 2007, just before the crisis, most of the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve was treasuries. It is in response to the crisis, with the effort to it is in response to the crisis, with the effort to inject liquidity and to remove bad assets from the banking system, that mortgage-based securities, those MBS, found their place on the Fed's balance sheet. So this was a way to reduce the risk of the financial system. And as you can see, the normalization has taken place. 2010, you see the share of MBS. 2018, you see the lower share, and it will move on. And the reason why I mention it is if you look at the European ECB, nothing that starts like normalization. If you look at the Japanese central bank, nothing that starts as normalization. We are in a different pace when we exit the ocean. And therefore, if it is a different place, how do we proceed from there? So this brings me to the guidance. When Stan spoke about the guidance in a very precise way, I wanted to just point to you, it's small letters, but I want you to tell you that guidance is not something that came down from heaven. It evolved. In 2012, the lowest part, you have a quote there from Janet Yellen telling you, I am now at about 10% unemployment. When unemployment goes to 6.5%, we will start thinking that we are moving in, we will consider things A, B, C, D. The market interpreted it as that 6.5% is a trigger. It doesn't matter what she meant. The fact of the matter is that the unemployment reached that particular benchmark in no time, very quickly. Only then people said, aha, but we need to know why did it fall. Did it fall because of part-timers? Did it fall because of discouraged workers that left the labor force? Doesn't matter. But the fact of the matter is that when you speak about guidance, you must make sure that you are not misguiding, because the loss of credibility is very significant. And that's why, and by the way, Mark Carney had a similar problem in the UK, that's why now there is a much, I will say, fuzzier, properly so, definition. Like in Israel, we spoke about svivat inflatia. We never spoke about a number. When we speak about vicinity of something, then it is like a pot. You put in a lot of things and you say, well, how is the economy doing? Unemployment is an important number. Inflation is an important number. Wages are an important number. And other things are important numbers. But this means that the more general you are, the less precise you will be, the less guiding you will be, but yet the more correct you will be. And this really, so you can see here several quotes of the Fed. The important point, and I repeat here the point that Stan said, each and every central bank during the past many years have had the number 2% in their statement. Don't ask me where they get it, it doesn't matter. In fact, Paul Volcker, each time he reads this statement, is jumping to the ceiling, and he doesn't have much to jump, he's very tall. He says, what do you mean? Inflation target of 2%. Price stability. For him, it is 0. So this is what it is. But once you agree to 2%, that's a quote from the Fed, 2%. That's a quote from the ECB, 2%. That's a quote from the Bank of Japan, 2%. That's a quote of the Bank of England, 2%. So they are all talking about 2%. question. No matter what? It's a real question. No matter what? Will you print and print and print until it reaches 2%? Is there a chance that Kuroda in Japan will yield 2% inflation? You can print until tomorrow. And the question is, are we bystanders from the side and say, okay, so it will take more time? Or do we have to ask, are there damages that may be to the economy that may arise from excessively low interest rate for too long? And it's a balancing act. It's not a trivial one. I think the US has done it very well, and indeed it is exiting in the right way. But the fact is that when we speak about the dots, and Stan spoke about it, again, look at the dots. The same dots that the central bank, that the governors are voting, are mentioning, it's a moving one. In 2016, in 2017, in 2018, etc., they are all statements about what they indicate is their, not forecast, belief, whatever you call it, for the endpoint. What does it mean? It means that if we look now at the dot schedule that was printed in September last month and compare it with the market forecast, you can see two things here. The market does not believe the dots. The market believes that the rates will be lower than what is implied by the Fed statement. That's it. It's not a test of credibility, it's nothing, it's just a fact. And as you can see, the dots, this is the median, they are spanning. There are quite a lot of votes, as Stanley described. And there are those above, those below, and then there is a median. You may ask yourself, but I don't want to open this discussion, is there a strategic voting on the part of governors when they say what is their rate? If you really want the Fed to raise rate very much, would you put your statement even higher so that the median will be pushed up, or what, or vice versa? I don't know the answer. I only know that as a guide of what it is, it has limited purpose, and it is what it is. Let me tell you now about the normalization. The fact is that we entered the ocean together. But from 2010 or 11, we means US and Europe, parted ways. Unemployment in the US has sunk like a rock. It is now 3.7%. Unemployment in Europe is still 8.1%. So there is no way that the two can afford doing the same thing, which is fine, but we should accept the consequences. So if one eases and one tightens, or one tightens and one does not move across, the gap increases. So the foreign exchange market will show the implication. It will be a mistake, of course, to intervene, to disturb that adjustment, because it is a reflection of what the reality that brings it about. When we speak about Europe, and I know I'm about to finish, when we speak about Europe, Europe is really reflecting the fact that having a constraint on not having exchange rates between the various currencies, because they are all bound by the ECB, by the euro, has a lot of benefits, but there is also some cost. You lose a degree of freedom. And you can see here that indeed the unemployment in Europe, whereas before the crisis it was very much converging to each other, in the peak of the crisis, there was no way that you could say they belong to the same bed. And even now, there is a very great diversity. So what may be good for Germany may not be good for Greece or Spain or whatever. Just a fact of life. And therefore, when we speak about normalization, just keep one thing in mind. The duration of unemployment in the US has declined significantly. It is now only, but it is the fact, only 23% of those who are unemployed today have been unemployed for more than 6 months. In Europe, 65% of those who are unemployed today have been unemployed for 6 months or more. That's a very different nature of labor market. It is clear that monetary policy can do nothing, not little, nothing to address the unemployment situation in Europe in this particular way. The issue is structural. The issue has to do with budget, structural, and the tragedy is that central banks have been extremely responsible. And if you are highly responsible, you are overburdened. And if you are overburdened, you are told you are the only game in town. And as they say in some of the side shops in California, when you tour, there is a side shops for ceramics, and it says, don't touch. If you break, you own. And there is a dangerous issue here of central banks having entered territories that really belongs to governments, but responsibility occasionally calls for duty, but that's a challenge. It is a challenge. The reality is, unfortunately so, in the US, inflation now is practically at the target, far away from Europe. Even the ECI, the Employment Cost Index in the US, is now closer to 3%, which is telling me one thing. It's time to continue normalization. And I will conclude only by putting one thing on the board. If you don't normalize, it's not neutral. So like always, there is type 1, type 2 errors. If you don't normalize, and you should have normalized, these are the costs. On the other hand, of course, if you normalize and you should not have, you may kill recovery. But let's remember that not normalize has a cost, and they all come from the financial sector. It's a new phenomenon that was not there 20 years ago, but it is extremely important. So there is here a long list, which I will not elaborate. I can only say that if the crisis started from excess leverage, the US is on its way to reduce leverage. You can see the chart. All sectors, other than government, have reduced leverage. Europe did not even start reducing leverage. Japan did not even start to lower leverage. So therefore, they are not going to be in the same boat that exits the ocean. They have been there together. And there is here last slide that says inflation targets is not a panacea. It's not something that you declare and it's done and you have an instrument and you can go. It's part of a large array of things. If you don't have the solid fiscal system, if you don't have a flexible economy, if you don't have central bank independence, if you don't have functioning capital markets, etc., like the long list, don't be surprised if it doesn't work, but it is not the inflation targeting that failed, but rather all the background music that did not play the harmonious background. Thank you very much.
I'm afraid we are running out of time, so we have to continue. Okay, so we are running out of time, so I'll close this session, which was definitely fascinating. I'm a slow thinker, so what I take away from the session is only Yankele, who was the last speaker. And one thing I have to think about is whether price stabilization necessarily means a 2% increase just because government decided so 20 years ago. The other thought I have to ask myself is the proverb of getting out of the ocean, whether getting out of the ocean by reducing the FX reserves has the same meaning for a small economy or large economy. Now, it may be true that if a large economy floods the market, like the US or the European or the Japanese, with all the reserves and assets it assembled, it may have one effect, And a small country selling some of its FX reserves as a substitute for increasing interest may have a different effect. But of course, every one of us will have his own thought. It was a very thoughtful, provoking session. Thank you to everyone, and we'll meet